Hi, I'm Justine from Swim Style Patterns, and this is the sewing tutorial for the Paloma top. You can access the sewing pattern in the links below, and all the information you need on what you need to sew this pattern is included in the pattern and available on our website. Let's get sewing. This is one of the two front tie sections. I've already sewn the pieces of the tie together. Now I'm just pressing it in half. Wrong sides together. Now I'll just show you from the end. Now turning the outer edges to align them, just out from that center fold line. They should be just under 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter wide. Now continue to press the entire length of the tie. Now just press the folded edges together and reinforce that center line. Now find the center of the tie and mark it with a pin. Now, by following the chart in step 2 of the sewing instructions, you'll find the amount you need to measure out from the center point. I'm doing a size small, so I've measured at 16.5 centimeters or 6.5 inches. From the center point on each side and marked each side with a pin. So these are our outer marks, and I'm doing a size small. This is the front section. So I'm now going to transfer my front tie lines onto the front section. This is the method that I use. There are many methods you can use to transfer your markings. I'll mark my markings with a lead pencil so you can see what I'm doing here. And I have the front section right sides folded outwards. With my pins, then I'll just use those pinholes to mark in the stitch lines on the opposite ends. Now I open up the front sections with right sides facing upwards, and I will just rule the gather stitch lines on each mark. Now take care on the pattern piece to trace off the gather stitch mark for your size. And also marking the center fold line on the top edge and on the gather stitch rows. Now stitch 2 rows of the gather stitch along the top edge between the notches only, and then another 2 rows of gather stitch on both of the markings on the front section. In the front section, right sides facing upwards. Take that tie that we've marked at the center and outer marks on before and align the center marks of the tie to the center mark on the stitch line, as you can see here. So just use this one tie for now as a guide to draw the gather stitches in on both rows. Now open out and align the lower fold line of the tie to the stitch line of the front section. Right sides together, pin the tie to the front section on the fold line of the tie. Just remember, this is the lower fold line, not the center fold line. Match the center and the outer circle marks of the tie section to the front section. Stitch the tie section to the joining gather stitch line between the circle marks. Make sure you're sewing on that lower fold line, and the lower fold line is aligned to the gather stitches. Now fold and press the lower edge of the tie upwards between the circle marks. Press and pin the folded edges together along the entire length of the tie. Now you can leave the tie hems raw and finish them later. I find it's best to do this at the last step after trying the top on and checking the length of the ties for hemming. Now you're going to stitch the folded edges of the tie together in one continuous stitch line. Fold the upper part of the front section down at the stitch line to make it easier to stitch the tie edges together through the front section. Begin stitching at the end of the tie and stitch the folded edges of the tie together along the entire length of the tie. Try and stitch as close as possible to the folded edges. Take care, as you can see the folded edges of the tie together across the top sections do not catch the actual underneath part. That's folded underneath of the front section. I like to continually check as I'm sewing through this little section that I'm not catching the garment. And once you've finished stitching that tie, just give that a press. I prefer to press it facing downwards. And then you can take your quick unpick and unpick the gather stitches. Now repeat this step to attach the remaining tie to the front section on the lower row of the gathering. So I've marked out my center and outer marks on the second tie section. And I'll just show you this quickly one more time. Another sewing tip is continually check your gathers are even as you sew along. So that means matching your center points and your outer points. So you can see here I've placed the folded lower edge upwards and I've pressed the folded edges together along the entire length of the tie. Now I'll just stitch the folded edges together along the entire length of the second tie. We'll now draw in the gathers between the notches of the front top section to match the notches of the yoke section. As you can see, I've also marked the center points of the lower edge of the yoke section and the top edge of the front section. Now right sides together, stitch the yoke to the front section and finish the raw edges. The front section should now look like this. So these are the channel sections which go in the back sections. I've already pressed the raw edges under, following the sewing instructions. And you'll notice the short ends, I've just tucked them under diagonally. And you can stitch those short edges down now before you place them on the back section, or you can just leave them pressed. This is one of the back sections. Now I've already transferred my placement ties onto the right side of the back section. And each back section has 2 channel casings that you'll need to stitch onto the back. Now I've stitched my channel casings down along the long sides only, and I've also stitched 2 rows of the stitches between the notches at the top edge of the back section. Now drawing the gather stitches in evenly to match the notches on the lower edges of the back yoke section. Check the gather folds are even before you sew the pieces right sides together. Finish off the raw edges. Now press the seam allowance upwards. Your back section should now look like this once you've finished those steps. Right sides together, bring the back sections together. Pin at the center back seam from the top double notch down to the hem. I've sewn the back sections together on the center back seam. As you can see, I've stopped at the highest double notch, so we have a back opening. Now press the seam allowance open and trim off as little as possible when you finish the raw edges on each side of the seam allowance. Now stitch the seam allowance of the opening to the wrong side of the back section as I have done. Stitch close to the seam allowance edges. Right sides together, stitch the front and back sections together at the shoulder and side seams. Press the seams open and finish the raw edges. Take care not to catch the ties on the front section as you sew the side seams. I've now stay stitched the neckline and the armholes in preparation to sew my binding on. So I'm going to make my own binding for the top. So I'm cutting my strips 5 centimeters or 2 inches wide to create a finished width, or 25 mil or 1 inch wide. If you would prefer to finish your armholes off with a single binding or a different width binding, you can also do that. Check the binding piece you are going to use on the neckline is long enough to have the ties, which are 12 inches or 30 centimeters long on each side. Unfold one edge of the bias tape and pin this edge right sides together to the neckline. And stitch the bias binding to the neckline at the fold line. Flip the binding upwards and press the seam allowance towards the binding. Now stitch the seam allowance to the binding. I'm sewing with the binding side facing upwards and the wrong side underneath. Stitch as close to the neckline seam as possible. Here I'm just going to trim my ties because they were a little bit longer than the instructed length. Now begin at the end of the tie, press the ends underneath and the folded edges together. When you get to the neckline seam, it's very important to press that folded edge just below the seam line, as you can see what I'm doing here. So then when you go to stitch it, you will catch the whole of the binding. As you come through to the other side, turn that short edge under and then fold the folded edges of the tie together. You're going to sew that in one continuous line. So I have turned my top section right sides upwards. Now I'm going to begin at the top end, stitching the folded edges together as close to the folded edges as possible. Once I stitch onto the neckline area, I'm stitching directly on the previous stitch line. This is why it's so important when you press the binding underneath in the previous step to just have it a little bit lower than that stitch line. So you should catch the entire binding. And just finish at the tie end. Now that's what it looks like. And this is the inside. The armholes are finished using the same double binding method as the neckline. So as I have stitched the binding to the armhole, you'll notice a gap at the side seam, and I've left extra length on each end of the binding. So I've trimmed off the excess length of each binding strip. I'm just going to pin it right sides together on the diagonal. And right sides together, I'll stitch the binding ends together after I check that this is going to fit the armhole. Then I'll trim off the excess seam allowance and press open. Also check the outer fold of the binding is still intact. If that's all good, you can go ahead and press that. Now just finish stitching the whole seam and continue on and follow the directions to finish the double binding, using the same method as what we did for the neckline. Now you're finished, your armhole should look like this. Now take a safety pin and attach it to the end of the tie. Thread each of the ties through the matching channel at the back, from the side to the center back. After you've completed threading the tie through, try the top on. Check the length of the ties before you trim any of the length off the ties. Then hem the length of the ties after checking the fit. Also check the length of your top. Adjust if necessary. Turn the raw edges under 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch and finish the raw edges and stitch them. That's it. You should have finished your Paloma top. Thank you so much for following along with our YouTube tutorial. If you did like this video tutorial, please remember to subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating videos like this one. And we really appreciate your time checking out our new favorite pattern, the Paloma top.